So whenever we're talking with organizations, with managers, whether they're line managers or HR managers, here's some advice that I think we can give. The first and most important one is to conduct a pay audit. We're never going to correct gender pay gaps if organizations are not even aware that they have a gender pay gap. And you would be surprised how many organizations are really in denial that they have a gender pay gap. So I'm going to give you a really specific example. There's an organization that we have worked with who thinks of themselves as very much a market leader. When they set wages, they're at the front end. They never want anybody to feel underpaid in their organization. And so they actually have a kind of semi-formal policy that anybody walking in the door as a new hire is going to get a 15% pay raise above what they were making at their previous employer. They were adamant that they did not have a gender pay gap because they were a wage leader. Be surprised, you do a gender pay gap, and in fact, women are making about 15% less. And this makes sense, right? Because when you say, I'm going to give everyone a 15% raise over what they were making at that other organization, you're still perpetuating any sort of bias that was in the market. So got to conduct a pay audit, got to see the data. I think it's especially important that organizations look at pay audits at different levels. And you've seen that in the data that I showed you today. At entry levels, the gap may be very small, but it will widen over time. And so you may need different solutions at different levels. Second piece of advice is put women on compensation committees. I gave you the evidence that when we see women on boards, we see gender pay gaps narrow. That's especially true when those directors are responsible for compensation directly, because then they have their hands on the data. Maintain pay through career breaks. Some of the most progressive organizations who are most committed to narrowing the gender pay gap, what they're doing is making sure that they stay in touch with parents, whether it's men or women, who are taking career breaks to make sure that they still have their performance reviews, that they don't lose out on any pay raises that the rest of their cohort is getting. We can encourage organizations to encourage both men and women to take parental leave. What happens as more men take parental leave is career gaps get normalized, right? It becomes less of an anomaly to have people be absent for a period. And that motivates the organization to pay attention to what's happening to compensation while people are away. A really important thing is to create a separate close the gap funding bucket. When organizations got motivated to address gender pay gap, one of the things they did was they went to their compensation budget, but that was money that had previously been allocated for pay raises or for promotions. And it's a really bad thing when you're correcting an inequity and therefore having to tell people that you can't motivate them by offering them a pay raise for very high performance. So smart organizations separate those two budgets. And finally, it's really important to sponsor women into leadership roles. The more women we have at the top, the more we are going to get women at every level, so that when we do the gender pay gap analysis at each level, we can do within level corrections, as opposed to seeing the huge gaps that result when women are all at the bottom and not at the top. And then we can think about what employees and applicants can do, right? We don't always think about employees and applicants as having a lot of power or clout in this system, but there are many of them. And if they engage in the same behaviors, they can be a very powerful force together. One really important thing is that when you enter an organization, you really need to educate yourself about pay ranges. Now, most people would ask family, friends, people in their network, what do you think is the right level of pay for this job? What can I expect? What is the pay range? The problem is that we often don't recognize how gendered our networks are. So women tend to rely very heavily on information that they get from other women who are usually underpaid relative to men in their organization. So they're getting very skewed information. So we need to get information about pay ranges from both men and women in our networks. I always encourage applicants, both men and women, to ask about gender pay gaps in interviews. And if your interviewer doesn't have the data, doesn't know where to look for the data, that's a really important red flag because it means they're not really monitoring pay gaps within the organization. You can also examine annual reports for gender diversity. The amount of gender diversity in leadership roles is probably a good indicator of how much gender pay gaps there are across the organization. Be sure and keep monitoring as you advance and change jobs. You know, we are really used to monitoring our progress based on improvements of what did we make last year or what did we make in the previous job. And we don't always recognize when the market has moved ahead of us. So we always have to be doing the comparison at every change point. And because you're probably not going to be fortunate enough to work for a progressive organization that is proactive in keeping in touch with you during a career break, you're going to have to be extra proactive at keeping in touch with your manager and asking and requesting that your compensation be reviewed along the way, even though you're not part of the organization at that moment, because the last thing you want is to fall behind. You really never make it up. So I am a really big fan of small steps. I really believe that those of us who are not in policy roles, we can still make a really big difference through education by putting this information in people's hands so that we can influence one manager, one job applicant, one organization at a time. This is the things that you can start doing tomorrow to help narrow gender pay gaps.